Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today, we're going to get a little bit more into this urban society by talking about the experience of living in cities. So, throughout today, we'll dive in a little bit into the conditions of cities and why people are moving to cities in the late 1800s. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the conditions as well as some of the events and effects of the growth of these cities, like, for example, the Great Chicago Fire. What you guys are looking at in this picture, this is a great example of what we would call a tenant. And this is a very small living space, oftentimes with multiple families, particularly immigrants living in an area of a city that we might refer to as a slum. And this was a common reality for many immigrants coming to the United States. So our first learning objective today, our big idea to kind of start things, is we're going to describe how cities begin to change, why people are coming, and why they're growing as we get into the late 1800s. So just to give you guys a couple of examples, certainly New York is starting to become, one of the largest cities in the United States. We've got Chicago, we've got Detroit. They're all starting to become pretty major urban centers. And 80% of their population overall is made up of immigrants and their children. And one of the big reasons why we see immigrants flooding cities is this is where a lot of the economic opportunity is. In fact, it doesn't just attract immigrants, it attracts African Americans, it attracts even women and others from rural areas to move to cities for these economic opportunities. One of the reasons why cities are flourishing is because of the nearby resources, whether it's iron, or steel, or coal, things that are needed in order to build up that city, to create factories, to bring more jobs and more economic opportunities to these urban areas. So you're going to see cities really begin to boom during this time period. And I misspoke earlier. I apologize for that. But the picture you're looking at was what we call a tenement, not a tenant. People who lived in tenements lived in tenants. So the poorest residents of these cities lived in these tenements, these very small, um, essentially rented rooms or even apartments, oftentimes several families living in them, with little sanitation and little regard for the safety of the people living in there. It was more of a way of making money. And they tended to live in these rundown urban neighborhoods, typically very poor, typically very crowded, we would call slums. Whereas people who were kind of in, like what we might call a middle class economic situation, they could go and live in these surrounding communities to the city because what they couldn't do is they could afford to drive in and they could afford to travel into the cities in order to work there. But they didn't, they could live outside of it. So those surrounding smaller communities are what we would call suburbs. So even in the late 1800s, you're starting to see a divide economically among people in regards to where they live, because the ultra rich are going to live further in these large states because again, they can afford to, especially with once the automobile gets to the United States with Henry Ford and subsequent companies later in the early 1900s, you're going to see that effect growing even larger. It's still, unfortunately, something that we still see today. So like I mentioned, the very rich, they built these mansions, these large estates, sometimes in cities, but in less crowded areas, or they built these huge estates in the country. And so there's all this extravagance, there's the growth of cities and the growth of industries, but in this time of extravagant wealth, there's also this terrible poverty going on in the heart of American cities. And so we see this age being called and referred to as the Gilded Age in US history. So what does this term mean? How does it apply to the economics of what's happening in US history? And what does it really tell us about what's going on? Well, the Gilded Age refers to something being covered in a thin layer of, here's where I want you to pause, here's where I want you to think. When something is gilded, there's this thin layer around it to make it appear. But as you dig deeper, what you're going to see is that thin layer of gold, let's say, that surrounds things, that makes things look great and better than they are. You dig down just a little bit, you start to see just how bad it is, how tough it is. And it's kind of a perfect metaphor for this time period because on the outside, it looks prosperous. It looks like people are doing well. Our cities are growing. Our economics are booming. We've got people who are wealthy. But when you dig down a little bit, you see that the treatment of immigrants, the immigrant experience in our inner cities, there's a lot of hardship there. And so it appears to look really nice on the outside. But once you go and experience it, you start to see that there are some things that need to be fixed. So, what does the growth of these cities mean for people's health, for sanitation, for different issues like poverty and even fire and crime? So, anytime you bring a bunch of people together, there are going to be consequences. And it does create some pretty serious problems during this time period, one of which is health problems. When you don't have sanitation, when you have streets that become very dirty and polluted, when you don't have people spaced out more, you're going to have more health problems because as people become closer in contact with each other, disease can spread much more easily. And that's one of the things you're really going to see start to happen in this time period. Also, when you crowd people in like this, it does create more opportunity for a disaster like a fire to occur because there's not enough attention spent on the safety of the people living there, and those crowded conditions can make a fire even more devastating. You also will see typically when you bring a bunch of people together, you'll see a higher increase in the crime rate. And typically, especially with groups that are impoverished, you see an increase in what we call minor crimes, like say stealing food. And you're going to see that done largely by people who were homeless, specifically homeless children, in order to survive. And so you're going to see those bigger issues of homelessness and poverty, but you're also going to see an increase in crime because you're going to see people having a hard enough time making a living and not being able to. So in order to meet their needs like food, they are going to commit crimes like stealing food. I want to give you guys an example. So there's a fire that occurs in Chicago, and this map does a great job of kind of showing you overall the total devastation when you look at Chicago from a whole. And Chicago is certainly not the city it is today. So this fire occurs in October, I believe October 8th, of 1871, and pretty devastating. We have about $200 million in damage at the time, which if we adjust for inflation was pretty close to about $3.75 billion. So a ton of damage. You had about 300 people die as uh, a consequence of this fire. You had about over 17,000 buildings being destroyed, 17,450. You had about 100,000 people left homeless because their homes were destroyed. And there's a lot of theories about how this got started. Everything from vandals and thieves all the way down to a cow kicking over a lantern. There's certainly a lot of theory out there about how it began. But certainly the congestion in poor neighborhoods, wooden buildings, streets, um, certainly being part of it. Um, and just the overall dry conditions really did fuel that fire. And there's probably, a couple of factors. Certainly, um, the availability of water with Lake Michigan and perhaps even rainfall might have helped the situation. But we do have to note that this does an incredible amount of damage, and Chicago's going to have to rebuild. So many people dedicated themselves towards rebuilding and trying to deal with some of the issues that dealt with poverty. You had religious groups, including like nunneries and other places, running orphanages, hospitals. You even saw them run prisons and try to essentially remove some of the criminal element and even recreation centers. Probably a really great example and one that particularly targeted immigrants was founded by Jane Addams in Chicago. It was a settlement house. A settlement house is essentially an institution, typically in a poor neighborhood where, again, many immigrants have been living, that provided them with services to adjust to life in this new country, whether it was medical care and child care, libraries for learning, or even classes in English. Tried to give them the skills they needed to transition from wherever they had been living to where they were living now. And this was called the Whole House in Chicago. And essentially tried to provide that transition, especially for immigrants coming into the United States. And again, that was founded in 1889 in Chicago by. So when we look at all of these problems in the growth of cities in the 1800s, which of these was not an issue? Unemployment, housing, disease, crime, or a surplus of jobs. So look at those. Pause if you need to. Best answer here definitely is a surplus of jobs. So surplus means we have more than enough. We'd have less of an issue with poverty if there were too many jobs or if there were more jobs for people. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit on how technology, especially transportation as well as architecture, is going to completely reshape cities as we know them today, um, and especially in the time period. So architecture begins to have new developments. You're going to see the first skyscrapers during this time, and a lot of changes in transportation are also going to emerge. You're going to see iron supports and even elevators um, led to, again, the creation by like Louis Sullivan and others of the first skyscrapers. You're going to have people like Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed New York's Central Park as well as several parks in Boston. And so needing to reshape the way cities look to include a little bit more of natural areas and to really just change the overall landscape of way our cities were organized. And so certainly steel is also going to become, a very big part of this. You're going to have people building the first skyscrapers. This is a very iconic photo of people eating their lunch up on a skyscraper and people again looking for jobs. You're also going to see again new forms of public transportation. You're going to see cable cars, trolley cars. They're going to pop up all over the United States. You're going to see subways, even new bridge construction. It's really going to help people travel within cities. So you're going to see some revolutions in how we travel between cities, like the automobile and Henry Ford in the United States. You're also going to see those changes here within cities themselves. So certainly you're going to see some of the first like suspension bridges being built, and again they're going to be utilized, to connect cities even across waterways. Just for fun, first skyscraper constructed in the United States, how 5 stories, 10 stories, 25 stories, 55. Your best guess, pause the video if you need to. The best answer here, and the correct answer would be 10 stories. Certainly they've gotten much more since then. All right, for my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes. Please ask me any questions that you still have. For those of you who are just listening, thank you. We appreciate the support, and hopefully we're helping build a little bit of understanding of the history of the United States. So thanks for listening, and have a great day, everyone.